And welcome back, everybody. We are chatting with Eric Ibarra and his brand new book, The Filioque, Revisiting the Doctrinal Debate Between Catholics and Orthodox. By the way, it's available on Amazon. And right before the break, you were sketching out for us exactly what is the Filioque, and beginning with the early controversies about the generation of the Son and the temptation to either stress the unity or to stress the diversity, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
But the Creedal statement is that the Son is eternally begotten or eternally generated from the Father. But then that leaves, what about the Holy Spirit?
Yes, exactly. So the people who were very philosophically minded, which were plenty, Christianity drew a lot of intelligent people, and specifically people who were Platonists, Neoplatonists, and just general philosophical minded in all ways. And so they were trying to incorporate the Christian faith metaphysically into systems, And so one of the early systems was to say that the Father is eternal, then the Son is the first creation of the Father, but he's like the Father in all ways, but he has a beginning. And then there's a third one that comes out, which is the Holy Spirit. But they didn't understand how to make it coherent, where the three were equal and equally divine and equally eternal. So the co-eternality. Because if they're co-eternal, we can't talk about one coming from the other, because whenever we talk about something coming from another, it's in the temporal constraints, you know. So, but as we were talking about before, the church spoke about an eternal production or an eternal generation. So then the question was, okay, fine, maybe that works with the Father and the Son. But the Holy Spirit, that's got to be like a force that comes out of the Father and the Son. And that's are we going to entertain the idea of another eternal production? So now the Holy Spirit is another divine person who is everlasting, eternal, and equal with God in all ways, naturally. But he comes from the Father, which means that the Father himself does not have a production from another. He himself, as the early Christians would say, he's the autotheos, which means he's like the font of deity. Here's the thing. If the Holy Spirit comes from the Father, what's the relationship between the Spirit and the Son? So you have two productions. The Spirit is being produced eternally. The Son is being produced eternally. What prevents that being two sons? Because if you have two generations or two processions, well, that just means that God the Father has two sons, and one son has a brother, and that brother has a brother, and so it looks that way. That question could be posed that way. And so what the early Christians in the West particularly, and this comes out most especially in Tertullian, it comes out in Hilary of Poitiers, you see it in Ambrose, you even see it in St. Athanasius, but principally the one who gives it the most forte is St. Augustine. And he taught that what actually happens is the Father begets the Son, and the Father and the Son together spirate the Holy Spirit as another divine person that comes from the two of them as from one principle. Now, this gets into a lot of metaphysical issues, and it's really hard to get this in to just you could have a whole course on this issue. But
That's true.
the idea is you have the memory. And then if you have like this is how Augustine thought of it analogically. If you have the memory of something, think of a tree or a car that memory is in your mind. Well, whenever you intellectually recall what a tree looks like, that would be an intellection. It's an act of your intellect. So the memory produces an intellection, which, oh, yes, I know what a tree is. Well, then there's the will that say, oh, I love the tree, or I want to see that tree, or I want to drive that car, whatever it is. That would be a faculty of the will, which comes after the memory and the intellect. And so here you have, the Father being like the memory, the Son being the word or the intellection of the mind, right?
Mhm.
And then you've got the will to want to unite with that thing that comes from two, memory and intellect. So Augustine used that analogy, those movements in a soul. So you have one soul, but then you have three processions. The memory produces the procession of the intellect, and then the memory and the intellect produce the procession of the will.
Hmm. Okay.
So he used the processions that we know exist in an intellectual soul, whether it's human or angelic, or in this case, God. So here you have three distinct things that all move in one being. So there's not three souls. Like, so whenever you remember your wife and then have that volitional will to be with her, that's not three different Gary Machudas that have a memory, an intellect, and a will. That's one Gary Machuda, or that's one Eric Ibarra. So in the same way, there's one God, but there's these three eternally processional activities. I hesitate to use the word activities because that gets into some other metaphysical issues. But analogically speaking, I think that the point gets across, and I think Augustine did that very well in his famous book called the De Trinitate. The issue is that the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed only said that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. And so it, but theologically, it was known that we could just say that he proceeds from the Father and the Son. And this was a sticking point for the later centuries between the Latins and the Greeks, because while there is recognition by Greek theologians like Saint Athanasius, Saint Epiphanius of Salamis, and I would say Saint Cyril of Alexandria. They do, in their theological commentaries, talk about the Holy Spirit coming from the Father and the Son.